All right, back to our top story. The IEC says it's happy with day one of special voting. Just over 1.1 million people had applied to cast their special votes. However, the IEC is concerned following a number of incidents since the voting process got underway today. 5 people were shot and wounded in uMzinto in the KwaZulu-Natal South Coast, while at Camperdown, 8 voting stations didn't open following a dispute over traditional leadership. For more on this, we're joined by Dr Dale McKinley, who is an independent political analyst and research and education officer at the International Labour Research and Information Group. Dr McKinley, a very good evening to you. Lovely chatting to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the Globe.
Good evening. Thanks for having me.
First of all, what's your analysis of how the special voting went today and, the incidents thereof?
Well, I think overall, from all the reports that I was at the ROC Center in Pretoria most of today, and the reports that I received was that in most parts of the country, the special voting went fine. That there was, as you mentioned, there were a few incidences in the Eastern Cape and KZN. But overall, it seems as though despite those very small amounts of stations and polling stations, or not polling, voting stations that were affected, overall, I think most people who wanted to do their special votes were able to do so without too much problem. So I think we need to, looking at the bigger picture, I think things we're looking okay. I mean, especially given that we're conducting this under COVID, we're still in the pandemic. It's an unusual time, and that this is sort of not last minute, but certainly the IEC was under pressure given the court case that was seeking to postpone these elections till next year. So yes, it's concern. I think there are some hiccups. We always have those hiccups, and I think overall the situation doesn't look that bad.
What would happen then to those voting stations which did not open for various reasons today?
Sorry, what should happen, or what? I didn't quite catch the question.
Will happen to those voting stations which did not open today for various reasons?
Well, my understanding is that provisions will be made. The IEC has done that before. If those who had come to those stations, I'm not aware of the numbers that were going to cast their special votes at those stations, but I'm sure those who in those areas who were going to do that, arrangements could still be made to do so. That would be my understanding. If they weren't, then that's going to be obviously unfortunate. But in this case, I think in the overall picture of the elections, it wouldn't be necessarily a train smash. It would be unfortunate. But if the IEC is able to deal with those problems and make sure that they have adequate security, which I think is always been the case, I think in KZN in particular, a concern, I think we shouldn't be too concerned, although obviously we'd hope that this does not happen again. That's for sure.
As much as, it is isolated incidents of voting stations which did not open today for various reasons, but do you foresee a case of a myriad or a litany of litigation against the IEC for those voting stations which did not open? For instance, some people may not be able to vote tomorrow and they had the opportunity of voting today, but only to find that some voting stations did not open. So do you foresee litigation against the IEC going forward?
That's always a possibility. And certainly if those who would like to litigate could prove that the IEC was at fault and they had not done their job properly to secure the voting process and the stations where people could come, then there possibly could be a case could be made. But oftentimes, I think if we look at these situations, and I don't have the specific details of exactly what happened, but my understanding is a result of protests and some anger in some of the communities towards what was going on, then this, in some cases, is a very difficult thing to deal with for the IEC, as we know from past elections. And I think it would be a very serious concern if it continued on to voting day. So if we had a situation on Monday where those same stations and even more were closed, or at least open late, or people were prevented from voting, then I think there would be a very, very strong case, not only for litigation, but to have to possibly rerun or have some special dispensation for people in those particular voting areas, for sure. Yes, I think so.
Yeah, sure, because, denying people the right to vote is a very, very serious matter. Let's talk about the security concerns. I mean, some people are actually concerned with their own safety, and there's issues of voter intimidation. We've seen in KZN, for instance, the myriad of political killings, not only in this particular election, but in previous elections as well. So do you get a feeling and a sense that the IEC has been able to adequately address those concerns with regards to security of voters?
Well, I think the IEC has done has done what they can. It seems to me, but I think we have to look at this situation given what's happened in the last several months leading up to these elections. I mean, first of all, it's quite clear that the preparations for these elections was not taking place under normal circumstances. The IEC itself was clearly at odds with potentially wanting these elections to be, they said they were ready, but, given the COVID situation, given the situation in KZN, given what happened in July with the violence in KZN and Gauteng, it's a large ask. That aside, it is the IEC's job, and it's certainly we expect them to make sure as much as is possible to secure the voting process. And if it can be shown that the IEC is not prepared in those areas, that it hasn't deployed, for example, hasn't arranged to deploy adequate security and ensure that process, then I think we should be concerned. I don't think we're at that stage yet. I mean, what has happened today should be clearly of some concern. As I said, if this then transfers into the similar scenarios on Monday, then I think we'd have a serious problem on our hands.
And other concerns have been raised about the safety of IEC personnel across the country. We've seen earlier on some IEC officers conducting, home visits for those people who are not able to go physically to the voting stations. And to get a sense, though, that the country's authorities, in particular the country's security officials, have been able to address those as well.
Yeah, I do think we have a challenge when it comes to the security situation, particularly in KZN, and where we've seen obviously a range of political assassinations and political violence leading up to ward candidates and being assassinated, and meetings, guns fired at meetings of ANC and so forth. So it is not a great situation, and I think we have to look at the police here. The IEC can only do so much. But if the security forces themselves, we have a deployment of 10,000 troops from the SANDF as well. It depends on where they're being deployed. But I think ultimately it is the police, the SAPs, that it should be responsible. And in that case, there is concern, because clearly what we saw in July was that in many cases the police were nowhere to be found, or that they weren't doing the proper job. Yeah. So I think the larger picture, besides what we're seeing today or what we might see on Monday, the larger picture is one of concern. It goes beyond elections. It goes to the political climate. I think that we're experiencing, where increasingly people are turning towards violence to sort problems out and to sort competition out, and that clearly is not the way that we can go. And if we continue to go in that direction, if these things continue to happen, then I think we could get to a situation where the legitimacy of the elections could be questioned. I don't think we're there yet, but certainly it is a serious concern, and it has to be taken with the seriousness it deserves.
There's been some consternation with some disenfranchised members of certain political parties claiming that some candidates are not their chosen preferences. Will this kind of conflict filter into the main election day come Monday, the 1st of November?
Well, we've already seen it being filtered in, obviously in the lead up, particularly within the ruling party, but also within other parties where this, as I said, this political climate is one of intolerance, and it's just, if our person doesn't make it, well, then nobody's going to make it, and we will prevent you from doing so by force. Yes, I would answer that question in the affirmative and say I do think it's going to affect the polls. I think that some people are going to be intimidated. I think that in some communities there's going to be forces at play that are going to try to prevent certain people from getting to the polls, or at least making it more difficult for them to do so. If you're voting in a climate of somewhat of fear and intimidation, that is not something that we should tolerate. So I think it is something that has now come into play quite substantially within our political electoral process. and we must address it now. We must address it seriously. What we're going to see on Monday is a test. Is our electoral system, are our security forces, are the political parties mature and responsible enough to continue the democratic process, or are we going to increasingly move in a direction which sees violence playing itself out, intimidation and fear, which I think would be not just to the political party concern, but a concern for our entire society and our democratic legitimacy.
Remember that a couple of weeks ago, various political parties signed the Electoral Code of Conduct that is aimed at promoting an environment that is conducive for hosting and conducting free and fair elections. So what about the intimidation of other candidates, such as independent candidates? Would you call this free and fair? And what are some of the punitive measures that will be imposed on those parties and candidates, as it were, who are intimidating other candidates? I mean, after having signed this Electoral Code of Conduct?
It's a very good question. And I think where we have our challenges is the Code of Conduct, like many regulations and other laws in our society, are good ones. And they have the correct things in them. The question is the enforcement of them. So what we see on paper is that if a candidate or somebody is caught trying to prevent somebody, or intimidating physically or otherwise, intimidating voters, or trying to prevent the electoral process from continuing freely and fairly, then they will either be disqualified, they should be disqualified, they should be taken, they could be brought up on criminal charges, they could be brought up on civil charges, the party could be fined. There are a number of different measures that could be taken. The question, of course, is, will that happen? And in our country, I think this is where the frustration lies with many of the citizenry, which is that we see people violating the law, violating regulations, codes of conduct, including, by the way, in the ruling party itself, where the ruling party and other political parties they've got their own codes of conduct. But when we see disciplinary hearings, they turn basically into a slap on the wrist. And people don't really have to take responsibility. And I think that concern is a truly difficult one that we must confront, and political parties themselves must confront. Because if we have impunity, if we have a situation where people feel, as many criminals in our society do, that they can get away with what they're doing, and politicians increasingly feel that way, or others that are acting on behalf of those politicians, then our electoral process, once again, the freeness and the fairness comes into question. So the IEC has a big job on its hands to make sure that its own code of conduct and the political parties themselves and their code of conduct are properly enforced. Otherwise, they're not worth the paper that they're written on.
Dr. Dale McKinley, we appreciate your analysis on this matter. Thank you so much for chatting to us this evening.
Thank you.
Well, Dr. McKinley Day is, a research and political analyst, and as well as a research and education officer at the International Labour Research and Information Group.